Okay, let me know for sure if you can hear me. We're gonna do a wheat bread tonight. Hopefully I'm not here by myself, other people. Okay, so a lot of people are asking about using their wheat that they have in food storage. So we're gonna do a demo of a recipe that I personally like for using up the wheat. It's one that actually tastes really good. The bread actually turns out not crumbly, which is what I hate about wheat bread. Okay, so this recipe it's based on a recipe that came from the blog what is it called? 2 Hearts Home or 5 Hearts Home, I think. I'll post the recipe after, but I'll also give you the amounts as I'm doing it this time, because this one is more about this recipe in particular, whereas the last one when we did white bread, it was more about technique. But we're going to go over some of the technique as well again also. Let me know if there's any problems, if you can't hear me or if you can't see what I'm doing. Please make a comment on the chat. Okay, so I personally like to use a mixer. You can obviously do bread by hand. People have been doing bread by hand for thousands and thousands of years. KitchenAid, Bosch. This particular mixer that I have is called an Ankerstrom. It's from Sweden. I really like this mixer. It is heavy duty for bread. I actually killed my first KitchenAid making bread, so this is what I upgraded to. I actually did keep a KitchenAid as well though, because I like what the KitchenAid does with other things. But this for bread is the best I think you can get in a home mixer. It has a really large capacity, and I just like the way it works. It's completely different from most mixers. The way it works, it does a roller and a scraper. It does a really good job of kneading. I think it more mimics a hand knead because of the roller. You'll see that when it starts going. But like I said, this is what I like. If you're going to use a KitchenAid and it's a smaller KitchenAid, you're going to want to half this recipe, because this recipe makes 2 loaves and it is a pretty big recipe for a small KitchenAid. If for no other reason, then some of the smaller KitchenAids don't have a lot of power. Same with, I think, the compact Bosch. I would be careful using a double recipe in that one too. But you should know your own mixer. The other thing about the mixer is you need to adjust your knead times based on what you're seeing in your mixer. So what I say for mine is probably not going to be exact for yours. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, this is, tonight I'm going to do a red wheat. Most people I think have a lot of red wheat in storage, or at least some amount of red wheat. So that's what we're going to do tonight. Just to show you the difference though. So this is, and I don't know how great this is going to show up on camera, but this is white and this is red. You can just see a slight difference. This has a little bit darker brownish gray color to it. This is a little more yellow tan. Other than that, there's not a whole lot of difference in the two. The berries look about the same. As far as storing wheat, hopefully you've already got it in an airtight container, whether it's a bucket or if you have it stored in cans. You want to store it in bug-free, air-free, and that'll give you the longest life. I think they're saying over 30 years now for wheat storage if it's stored in a cool, dry, bug-free, light-free. Sorry if you hear my dishwasher in the background. I'll turn it off if it gets loud. Okay, so wheat is a totally different thing than white, because the wheat that you grind or wheat flour that you buy at the store has all the parts of the wheat, all the parts of the berry are in it. That makes for difficulty in developing gluten. I talked a little bit about that in the last class. It's because of the bran and the germ as it grinds the wheat. They're sharp. They actually cut through the strands of gluten as the gluten develops. So gluten is the 2 proteins. Once you hydrate the 2 proteins that are in flour, you end up with gluten. And the longer you knead, up to a point, you develop that gluten. And the gluten is what makes your bread's texture the way you really want it to be. Okay, so this recipe, it calls for either white or red. I think the original recipe calls for white, but you can use either, and you can alternate back and forth. If you have both in storage, try out both, or try out a combination. It's not going to matter. You are going to see a difference though. I actually think that in some ways the red turns out better. It's a little fluffier sometimes, but the taste is stronger. So if you have people in your family that really don't like the taste of wheat bread, go for the white flour or the white wheat. It'll give you a little bit lighter flavor, and it's a little bit lighter in color, so it's not quite as brown when it's done. Most people like, if you don't like white, or if you don't like wheat bread, you'll like the white wheat a little bit more. This recipe, honestly though, it turns out good enough that unless they really have some problem with wheat bread, they're gonna like it. Okay, so the one thing that I've done different in this is, after grinding my wheat, I actually sift out a portion of the bran. And you can keep that if you want, it's not a lot. I'll actually show that in a minute, but I'm gonna get this recipe going so that it can be sitting. This recipe actually has a rest time with the first few ingredients, and that is what really gets your gluten jump started. So we're gonna do that. Okay, I talked before about how I like to measure my flour by weight. You can measure by volume, you can measure by cups, but it's really easy to get too much flour. And you don't want too much flour because that's what gets your bread dry and crusty, and you get that more crumbly texture. Okay, so this recipe calls for 2.5 cups of warm water. I actually go a little bit warmer than what I want it to be because I want it to be extra warm for this first part, but you don't want it hot. So you want to be able to touch it, and obviously it's not going to be too hot. It would be maybe a little bit warmer than baby bottle or really warm baby bottle temperature. So we're going to put that in first. Okay, and then the wheat, I already have sifted this one, but we'll talk about sifting in a minute. But here's my scale. I don't know if you guys remember this from last time. If you didn't watch the last time, get a scale. It is indispensable. I think I paid about $10 for this one at Smith's. It's an OXO brand. You can get any kind you want. You can get a fancy one. You can get a nothing one like this one. But get one that has a zero out feature or a tare function on it. What that does is you turn it on. I know this kind of freaks out on the camera, but you turn it on, it's going to read 0 obviously. You put a bowl on and it's going to weigh the bowl. But you can zero that out. You hit the 0 out or the tare function and that turns back to 0. So now it's still got the bowl on it, but it's not weighing the bowl. So now it's only going to weigh what you put into the bowl. So we're going to go ahead and add, so that was 2.5 cups of really warm water. Now we're going to add 490 grams, and I do use grams, I think they're more accurate. So 490 grams of fresh ground, or you can get bagged. You are going to see a difference if you use it bagged, but I like the fresh ground. I think it's a lighter taste. It gets a little bitter after it's been ground, so I usually grind mine right before I start baking. 490 grams of whole wheat flour. I like the grams because it's a little easier to be really super accurate with. So there's 490. Okay, we're going to put that right in the mixer with it, with the water. Sorry if I look awkward, it's awkward to use your mixer from the back side. Okay, the other ingredient that's going to go in this first part, there's 2 more actually. The other thing that's really important to store when you're going to store flour for using, during hard times or even just normally, is Vital Wheat gluten. It's a powder. This is it here. It's kind of a yellowish tan powder. It's really fine. You can get it in health food stores. You can get it in like the area where they usually carry like the Bob's Red Mill things. I know right now you're going to have a hard time finding this kind of stuff if you don't have it stored. You can try making bread without it. Your results are going to be much different. Just like I said last time, if you start altering a recipe and trying to substitute or leave things out, it's going to turn out different. Okay, so this is going to go in this mixer bowl too. It is 1/4 cup of Vital Wheat gluten. Okay, the last thing that we're going to put in, I'm going to turn this on. Hopefully it's not going to be too loud for you. It's a pretty quiet mixer, but I know it gets a little bit loud. Let me know if you're having a hard time hearing me. So we're going to let this mix up, so it's just going to be kind of a sticky mess. It's not going to look like something that looks like bread dough, but it's going to jump start your gluten. Okay, now I'm going to add my yeast. This is a tablespoon of instant yeast. You can use dry active, active dry, however you want to say it. The only difference is really the size of the pieces. The size of the granules on active dry yeast is larger, and so it has a harder time, a little longer time to dissolve. So if you're using active dry, you're going to want to activate that in about a half a cup of water. So use 2 cups in here and use a half a cup to activate your yeast. But since this is instant, if you have instant or rapid rise, anything that's that, you can throw it right in. So we're going to get that mixed in really good. Any questions so far? Okay. Just making sure. I don't want to ignore people. Okay, so now we're going to turn this off. And because you don't want bread to dry out, you never want bread to dry out. It's always going to make for a worse situation with your bread. You're going to cover this up. I actually just covered up with a towel, a clean kitchen towel, which I forgot to grab before I started. Okay, so you're just going to cover it up with a clean towel, kind of tuck it in so that it's nice. And this is going to sit. You want this to sit for at least 10 minutes, but I actually think 15 minutes is even better. So let that sit. You're going to let it just sit in your mixer bowl. If you have a lid, if your mixer is one that you can actually put a lid on it, that's fine. I actually think a kitchen towel works good. So we're going to let this sit. So while this actually rests, what's going to happen in that bowl is it's going to start hydrating that wheat. So it's going to hydrate the proteins that are in your flour, and it's going to jumpstart your gluten formation. So after about 10 minutes, you're going to see a huge difference in the way this looks. And at about 15 minutes, there'll be an even bigger difference. So between the yeast in there, it's going to start activating as well, so you're going to get a little bit of bubbling. But what's really happening is the hydration of that flour. And that's key to getting your gluten going. I think that you can not sift your flour. If you really want to just use it as it is, that's fine. But I really think that taking that little bit of the hard, really sharp pieces of the wheat berry out gives you just a little boost to get your gluten staying, not getting that effect of the bran and the germ. It helps it start developing. Okay, so this is the part about, we're going to look at the sifting part here. So this is flour that is just milled. I don't know what kind of a mill you have. I actually can't even think of the name of what I have, but you can, on mine, you can set it for different grinds. This is a really fine grind. It's really, really, really fine. Even the bran and the germ parts, you can tell, are really fine in this flour. Most electric mills have adjustments for that. You can adjust both the feed rate and the motor speed. And you get those at just the right combination, you're going to get a finer flour. There's a lot of mills, if you're using like a KitchenAid attachment, that actually, sometimes it's better to do a double. So you're going to go through with it once on a really coarse grind, and then you're going to send it back through. I've heard that the KitchenAid attachments can get really hot, so you might want to plan ahead so that you're maybe milling that twice, a little bit of time apart, so you're not overheating your mixer. But if with a regular electric mill, you shouldn't have a hard time milling it fine. You just got to get the right combination of, like I said, the feed rate and your motor speed. Okay, so this is straight from the mill. It hasn't been sifted yet. The sifter that I have, it's just a regular strainer that I use. It's actually a Cuisinart one. I'm going to dump this out. It's pretty fine. I don't know if you can tell, but it's a really fine mesh. Not sure how well that'll show up on camera, but it's finer than what you would probably like strain noodles or something. It would be a little bit finer than that. And this is what I've been using. If I was going to say the whole size, we were looking at like, what, between maybe just a little bit bigger than a 1/16 of an inch as far as the size of the holes in it. So it's pretty fine. Okay, so with the fresh ground stuff, all I do is just scoop it in there. You don't want to fill it too full because it gets messy. I just want to show you what comes out. So when you sift it, the easiest way is just to shake it back and forth. You can kind of beat it against the side of the bowl. This bowl's a little bit shallow, but I wanted to show you what actually ends up here. It doesn't seem like it would matter, but I've actually tried it both ways and it does matter. There's just a little bit difference. If you do white, you'll actually end up with more. I don't know if it's because it's just that much harder or what, but at least this batch of red that I have right now in storage, it doesn't actually come out with a lot. Here, let's see if I can get up here so you can see it good. So this part that I'm sifting out should mostly just be the bran. It just kind of looks flaky. Hopefully that's showing up on the camera. But that's what we're taking out. It's just little sharp flakes that come off of the outer part of the wheat berry. And like I said, in this, it's not much. You would think it wouldn't matter, but it actually does. So that's out of probably about 1.5 cups. That's about how much came out. When I've done my white, it's been quite a bit more than this, probably at least double, if not triple, of what's left in the strainer. Okay, so the next part of this recipe actually calls for, if I can remember, okay, so the second batch of flour that you add to this recipe is 350 grams of flour. So let's go ahead and measure that out. See if I've got enough sifted already. Okay, so same thing as before. You're going to put your bowl on your scale. It's weighing the bowl right now. You're going to zero it out, and then you're going to start measuring your flour into there. So I talked before in the white bread recipe about how to use the scale, but we didn't talk really about measuring flour. So while this has got to rest, let's talk about measuring flour. Without the bread, let's forget bread. Let's just talk about measuring flour. So if you've got your flour in a container, whether you keep it in a bucket or a canister, and you scoop into it, you naturally are going to get a little bit heavier. What's in your cup is going to end up being heavier than what a real cup of flour should weigh. So white flour, in other words like bread flour or all-purpose flour, should weigh in at about 120 grams per cup. Wheat flour is a little bit heavier because it has other parts of the wheat still left in it. They're not removed. And it should end up about 140 grams per cup. This is actually not a cup. It's a 3/4 cup. So when I put it on here, it's not going to show 120 or 140. But all right, so we're looking for 350. Hopefully I have enough here. And then we'll have to add more. With my luck, I will not. Nope, I'm not going to. Oh, we're so close. All right, hang on, I'll put a little bit more. So the other thing about using the whole grain is obviously you're getting other nutrients that you wouldn't be getting in white flour. A lot of people prefer the taste of it. A lot of people prefer getting the extra nutrition that's involved in having whole grain. Some people, they actually can tolerate it digestion-wise a little bit better. It's kind of one of those things you have to try out for yourself. But to me, the worst thing about making bread or anything else out of whole grain is if your family doesn't eat it, it's a waste. So if you're going to store wheat, you need to store the things that also are going to make you, bread and other goods that are actually going to be worth your while baking. You're not just going to be wasting your ingredients. Okay, so we're looking for 350. And there it is. Okay. So we're going to set that aside for just a minute. Let's talk about what I started to talk about. So if you don't have a scale and you're measuring flour, the best way to do it, get yourself a butter knife or something else that has a really flat edge, something that has a really flat side, and use that to help you scoop it out. So you're going to want to fluff your flour in whatever container it is, fluff it up so that it's not compacted at all, and then load your cup, kind of, scoop it in. If nothing else, you can scoop up against something. And then when you've got it full, it's hard to get it full in this bowl. When you've got it full, you don't want it to compact at all. You want it to be very lightly in that container. And then you're going to want to scrape it off. That's the closest you're going to get to an accurate measurement for anything. Whether you're making cookies, you're making a cake, whatever you're making, muffins. If you're not going to weigh your flour, Be really gentle about loading up your cups, and then, you know, especially like I'm lazy sometimes with sugar, but if you're gonna load up the cup the normal way where you're tamping it in, you're gonna end up with heavy, and that's gonna affect your baked good. If you carefully load it in, fluff it up, and then scoop it off so that it's really flat, that's closest to the most accurate measurement you can do. Okay, so I had somebody ask earlier about high altitude adjustments. I'm very into high altitude adjustments because there's nothing that makes me crazier than to try out a recipe that I find somewhere and have it not work. And because we're at what, 4,700 feet above sea level here, it's easy to have a recipe that, you know, should turn out decent, not turn out decent. So there's a few adjustments you can make. Where's my phone? So somebody asked in particular about the bread part. So for bread, at a higher altitude, it doesn't matter if you're using yeast or baking powder or baking soda, you want less leavening. So with yeast, you're going to decrease it by 25%. So if you're using a tablespoon, you're going to use 3/4 of a tablespoon. You can convert that into teaspoons, that'll be easier. And that's above 3,500 feet. I don't know why I want to say square feet, that's stuck in my head. And it's also going to have a shorter rise time. As far as other ingredients that can affect it, with bread, the other one you're going to want to make note of is liquid. So with this, it calls for 2.5 cups of water. The higher you are, the more liquid it needs. So it's about a tablespoon at 1,000 foot above sea level, and then for every 1,000 feet above that, it's another about teaspoon. You could go a little more than a teaspoon. So however many feet you are above sea level, if you're 7,000 feet above sea level, you're going to be that extra tablespoon plus another 6 teaspoons of extra liquid. And that goes for any recipe you're making. Doesn't matter if it's a cake, muffins, even cookies. It needs a little bit extra liquid. And the reason for that is the evaporation. When it gets in the oil, or when it gets in the oven, it evaporates at a different rate at higher altitude. So that's what you're compensating for that. And it doesn't have to be water or even milk. I mean, even if you wanted to increase the liquid by using an extra egg, but you still want to aim for that measurement. You want to aim for really close to that measurement that I gave. So it was a tablespoon at 1,000 and then a teaspoon for every other 1,000. And on the yeast, it was 25% less if you're above about 3,500 feet. There are some other adjustments you can make for other baked goods. As far as bread though, I think those are really the only two that are going to affect your bread. I wouldn't really adjust anything else. I mean, if you're really, really high, you're going to have to do some trials on your own. But for anywhere in Utah, I think you're going to be good. Okay, so I think we're getting close to about 10 minutes here on the bread that's resting, the part of the bread that's resting. The rest of this recipe, there's some other ingredients here. I talked about this the last time, but if you start leaving out ingredients when you're trying a recipe, that you're not going to have the same results. So when you make a whole grain product, there is a reaction that occurs, that's baking science, that when you add an acid to whole grain, it's beneficial. So in this recipe, the acid that we use is lemon juice. Some use vinegar. I prefer lemon juice because I think sometimes you can taste the vinegar. However, if you like a sourdough flavor, you might actually enjoy a vinegar. But I personally, in this one, I like the fact that it doesn't have that flavor. I like the lemon, it just kind of goes away. Okay, the other ingredients in this is salt. Don't leave salt out of your bread. I said this the last time too, there's a lot of recipes going around right now for, you know, depression era foods. I think some of them are really incomplete. There's a lot of screenshots of recipes going around. One of them is for bread. It has no salt in it. Obviously you can make bread that doesn't have salt, but it has a job. So salt in bread controls the rise of the yeast and it gives flavor. The flavor of salt is a huge thing in bread. If you make it without, it's going to have kind of a flat taste. It's not going to have a sweet taste where you think, you know, if you left out the salt, it would taste sweet. It's not. It's going to taste flat. So you don't want to leave out salt. If you find that it's too salty for you, you can reduce it. This is a tablespoon, but for me, I would try it out like this and see what you think. I don't think it's salty, and I'm usually pretty sensitive to salt. So that's a tablespoon of salt. This is 4 teaspoons of lemon juice. And then the other part that goes in this is honey. And I actually have these two things mixed together because it's the easiest way. But it's 1/4 cup of honey and 1/4 cup of oil. In this case, I like coconut oil. So if you buy the stuff like from Costco that comes in the big jar, you just want to melt it in the microwave till it's not hot, but just so that it's melted. And then I just add my honey in with it. So 1/4 cup of oil and 1/4 cup of honey. And the oil is a softener. It will make your bread softer. It will make the texture a little bit softer. You get a little bit of fluffiness out of the oil. The honey obviously adds sweetness and flavor, but what it also adds is it's kind of an emulsifier, so you get that effect from that honey that will give you more of a smooth dough. There's science behind honey. Okay, so let's look and see what this is.
Question.
Oh, we have a question. Hang on.
On your recipes, are they already adjusted for high altitude, or do they need to make those adjustments?
Okay, so these recipes work where I am, which is about 4,700 feet. We're about 4,500 feet here. So if you're above that, you're going to want to adjust. So anything that's above that, I would go for each 1,000. So obviously we're already above the 1,000 for liquid, so you'd want to add another teaspoon for every 1,000 you're above me. And as far as yeast, I would still do, if you're a lot higher than me, reduce your yeast a little bit. If you're not a whole lot higher, I would try this one out at what it is and see if you like it. If you feel like it collapsed a little bit or it was too fast rise, you can reduce that yeast. But definitely the water, I would try adding a little bit more water. I said this before in the other one about white bread, but the biggest enemy of making good bread is the amount of liquid. So you want a wet dough. You don't want your dough to be dry. You don't want your dough to be easy to handle. It needs to be sticky, because while it rises, that first proof, your bulk proof or your bulk rise, that first rise you do, is where all of your flour really gets hydrated. If you get your dough too dry at the kneading stage or even before the kneading stage, your dough is going to be way too dry by the time you get through that proof. So you want it to be sticky. People that make by hand, some people know this already, it's going to be hard to knead. You're going to have a sticky mess. It's going to be shaggy and sticky, and then you're going to have to work with it for a while until you get to that point where it's not that. And by the time you're done kneading, it really shouldn't be too bad. It should be more in the range of tacky. So when you touch it, it still has that little bit of suction to your finger. If it feels dry, it's too dry. If it feels smooth, it's too dry. You've got to add a little bit more liquid. I don't know that I ever add more flour. I find myself always adding more liquid, if anything. I know there's always talk about how, the weather affects it. I don't even find that so much a big problem here because we're so dry here all the time. Doesn't matter if it's raining or not. We don't really have a lot of humidity, but I'm sure there's places, in the world that really is a problem where it's really humid. I don't find that to be an issue here. Like I said, if I'm going to add something, it's probably always going to be more liquid and not more flour. Unless I've screwed up, and that never happens, ever. Okay, so let's look at this. You're going to see that it's changed. You can see it's stretchy. See how that's already stretching? That's your gluten that's already starting to form. That's exactly where we want to be. You can feel the heat and the moisture coming off of it as soon as you take that towel off. Okay, so now we're going to turn this back on and we're going to add the rest of our ingredients. Hopefully, like I said, it's not too loud when this is on. Let me know if you can't hear me. You can already tell that's a way different dough that's already in there. It's got a lot of stretch already going. Okay, so now we're going to add, I'll repeat these just so you've got them. Let's go back again. So this is 490 grams of whole wheat flour, 2.5 cups of water, 1 tablespoon of yeast, and 1/4 cup of vital wheat gluten. You can actually, even if you find that your wheat is, if it's still, your bread's still not the right texture, you feel like it's too crumbly, and you feel like you've done everything else right, you can up that vital wheat gluten but I would try it at the 1/4 and see what you think. So now we're going to add these. This is our oil. You can use other kinds of oil. You can use vegetable oil or canola oil. I just really like the flavor of the coconut oil in this. I think it adds to it to me. I haven't made it with other oils, but I know they're interchangeable. So if you want to change and do a different kind of oil, that's fine too. So it's a 1/4 cup of oil and a 1/4 cup of honey. So we're going to add that in. Now let that combine really good. We're going to kind of beat it up a little bit before we add the rest of the flour so that all of these things are in there really well. So you'll notice that this recipe is a lot different than the white one, where I really just dumped all of the ingredients in for the white one. The wheat is a little more finicky. You gotta kind of finesse the wheat to get it what you want it to be. Okay, so this is 4 teaspoons of lemon juice. And I just buy the bottled lemon juice, just like at Costco in a big bottle. It's great for lemonade, great for baking. It stays good pretty much forever in your fridge. Turn this up just a little bit. Okay, so we want to kind of get these things beat up in here. Okay, the last thing I'm going to add is a tablespoon of salt. Yes, that sounds like a lot, but this is 2 loaves. Pretty much on average, you're going to end up always having about 2 teaspoons of salt per loaf. So that's about what this is. So we get this all beat up in here. Okay, so all those ingredients are pretty much well combined. I'm going to slow this back down. And this is our flour, the second round of flour. This one is 350 grams of another batch of whole grain. Like I said, you could do the first as red and this one is white. You could do half and half both. This is all red in this one, just because that's what I had ground, so that's what I'm using. Also, I think I mentioned this, but you're going to get a better flavor out of your flour if you grind it right before you use it. Wheat flour has a lot of oils in it, and they start getting a little bit rancid. It doesn't really taste rancid though, it usually tastes bitter. And so that's where you get that bitter wheat flavor, and a lot of people really don't like that. That's where you're going to not have that if you do this. Do it fresh ground. You're going to see a huge difference in the taste. Alright, so now the flour's in there, we're going to turn it up again. Okay, this is the part where you're going to knead. If you're kneading by hand, this is going to take you a while. If you're kneading by machine, it's going to take you a while. On my mixer, it takes about 12 minutes. At 12 minutes, it's usually about right. This mixer has a little bit gentler knead, so yours might be a little bit shorter time. Your mixer might not take as long as mine. This one, like I said, where it has the roller instead of a hook that kind of tosses the dough around. This one is a little bit gentler version. Get this going so it's all combined. There's still some dry flour in there, so get this over so we're more in the center. There we go. Okay, so we're going to let this knead because I want to show you that even with the wheat flour, you can still get the right, you can still do your gluten formation test. Talked about it in the white bread. It's not different for the wheat bread. You're still going to do a window pane. It is going to be a little different when you do it because it is easier to tear. But you should be able to still see that you've got that gluten. When you start pulling the dough up, you'll see that it does have that super stretchiness to it. So I got to kind of babysit this because it likes to climb the hook for some reason. I don't know why the wheat does that, but I'll babysit this while we talk about the other part of the bread. So I've got one batch of dough. I'm going to slide this back to the side. I've got one batch of dough that I've already made. Okay, so I made this batch just right before we started. It's been proofing So I talked about this also in the last class. You want to proof somewhere that's warm. My favorite place is in my microwave. I have a microwave hood combination over my stove. It has a halogen light that sits over the top of the stove, and if I turn that light on that sits over the stove, it heats up the inside of the microwave perfect. Some people have ovens that have a proof cycle. That works great. Some people have warming drawers that have a proof cycle. That works great. You don't want it too hot, you'll cook your dough. Some people like to turn on their oven for a few minutes and then turn it back off. I don't have good luck with that. I either forget that I turned the oven on and then it's too hot in the oven, or I've actually been known to turn the oven on while the dough is in there, and I don't want to do that either. So if you're better about that than me, use your oven. Otherwise, I would stick with a microwave or another really warm spot, whatever the warmest spot in your kitchen is, and it needs to be where there's no draft. Draft is going to delay this process. So you can see the difference in the size here. This dough and this dough are exactly the same recipe. This is at least doubled right here. So we're going to talk about shaping. We did this last time too. So you can choose however you want to do this. I personally like to use my bread board. I just have a really large cutting board that I use specifically just for shaping my breads. If you like to do it on your counter, that's fine. I just don't like the cleanup. I like that I can take this to my sink and just clean it up in the sink if it's really sticky. But normally it's not sticky and I can just wipe it down. I don't use flour when I shape because I don't want to add flour to this bread. I don't want to dry it out at all. Okay, just like I'm into weighing my flour, I'm also into weighing my dough. So if I am making multiple loaves of bread, which this is 2 loaves, this recipe makes 2 loaves that are about 1.5 pounds. If I am going to make 2 loaves, I'm also going to weigh those loaves. So we'll pour this out and we'll talk about shaping here while this thing kneads. Okay, so you can see this dough is quite a bit different now. It's got a lot of bubble to it. It's all puffy. It's very soft. It's not sticky, but it's not dry. When I touch it here, you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. So you can see it's still a little bit tacky, but it's not sticking to me. That's the other thing about the dough. I know last time when we made white, I told you about touching it to make sure your hydration was about right. The wheat is a little more finicky when you touch it. It should still feel sticky, but I want to say it's more like suction. I don't know how to describe that, but when you touch it, you're going to feel a suction there. It's not so much going to come away on your finger and stick like the white. It's okay if it does, but when you test it that way, you're not going to get that same effect out of it. Okay, so this is 2 loaves. My favorite tool for cutting these in half is a bench scraper. I have a couple of them. I don't love any of them. The only thing I do love about them is they have rulers. I said that before. But basically, all it does is make it easier to divide the dough. So when I divide mine, I just kind of eye it at first. And then I'll weigh it. Okay, I have no idea where my scale went. What did I do with my scale? Oh, there it is. Sorry, our scale went missing in action. Okay, so same thing. I just use a bowl. I zero it out on the scale. And I'll add my dough. It should be, with this recipe, it's going to be about 870, I think. So that one's about 870 right now. Maybe I'm not good. Oh, that one's a little bit low, a little bit light. Maybe I lied. Maybe it's 850. Oh, it's about 825. Okay, so about 825 is where we're going to be at. And that's when they are baked, they'll be about 1.5 pound loaves. Alright, so shaping with a wheat bread is just as important as shaping with white bread. Same technique when you're making a loaf though. You don't want to mess with the dough any more than you have to, but you do want to do this part. It's important. And the reason is because it keeps your gluten, the gluten formation, so that it can hold all of those air bubbles that the yeast creates, the carbon dioxide that the yeast makes is what you're holding in, and the gluten structure is what holds that in. You can see this is still sticky, so it's going to stick to itself more than it's sticking to me though. So I'm just going to press it out with my hands to be a rough rectangle-y shape. Doesn't have to be perfect. This isn't cinnamon rolls. And then we're going to fold it just like you're putting it in an envelope. So in thirds and in thirds. Okay, you can do this again if you want. I actually find with the wheat bread, it's not really super necessary to do it twice, but if you want to turn it and press it back out, you can, and do that again, same process. But I actually just like to roll mine. So the pans that I like, same pans that I use for my white. Talked about them before. Maybe you can see it's the logo in it. It's called USA Pan. This is the 1 1/4 pound loaf pan that they make. It's about, I want to say it's 9.5 by 5 by 3. They do make one size bigger that's just a little bit bigger. Then they make one that's quite a bit smaller. I don't like the smaller one. I do like this one. It's the 1 1/4 USA Pan. I love these pans. They have a really great nonstick coating. You don't really have to grease them. I put just a really light spray, and when I say light, I mean like barely misses them, and they never stick. I've had these pans for about 2 years. I don't really send them through the dishwasher unless there's something, some reason I really need to, but I really just wipe them out, and they have a really great coating. I love these pans. So this is my same pan that I use for my white. We're going to use that again on this. Same technique with the white. You're going to poke with the fingers, and you're going to roll with your thumbs. So you're going to start rolling, and you're really tucking. Those fingers really tuck, and the dough sticks to itself. You're combining those back into itself. You're tucking really tight, and you're rolling. And the outside, is it too loud? The outside is getting stretched. You don't want to be too rough with it because you don't want to break this. This is your crust. This is what develops your good crust on your dough or on your bread when you're done. So you want to keep that nice and tight. It should get really smooth. You can see, I'll actually hold it up so you can see it. I know this camera's really not good for detail, but I'll hold it up and maybe you can see it a little better. Pinch that closed so you got a seam at the bottom. Let me hold this up so you can see. Hopefully you can actually see that. It's really smooth. You stretch that up with your thumbs and you just create, you can almost see the lines even as I've stretched it, but it's very smooth. You can kind of tuck your ends under if you want. How beautiful you make your loaf is up to you. For me, as long as I get it shaped to this point, if the ends aren't perfect, that's fine. You can tuck the ends if you want. They usually end up about the right size. You just smush them out a little bit to fit in that pan, but as you can see, that turns out pretty much perfect for that pan. So we'll go over it once more time with this one. Same thing. You want to work fast with your dough. You don't want it to dry out. If it starts getting dry, you're going to take a little extra time. Cover that one in a bowl. Cover the second loaf in a bowl with a damp towel. Don't let it dry out. If it does get too dry, I actually have keep a squirt bottle that I only use for kitchen water. I actually use it more for my sourdough because I like to add water to the top of my sourdough loaves. But I keep this as well. If this gets dried out, spritz it a little bit. There's no problem with spritzing the dough. You want to add moisture, not flour. Okay, so this should still be sticky. I added that little bit of water and it's right back to being sticky because it did dry out a little bit while we were talking. So same thing, stretch it, fold it like you were folded up to go in an envelope, and then you're going to roll. So thumbs at the back, fingers are going to poke. You stretch it with the back and you poke that dough as you're rolling it. And you can see I'm not really making a lot of movement. I'm kind of pulling the dough toward me, almost like it's eating through the dough, and it stretches it out to the sides as you go. This part gets smooth the more you stretch it. If you get too rough with this, you'll start breaking that. You'll start seeing breaks in the dough. You don't want that. You want to be gentle, but you also want to be tough as far as poking it goes. Okay, so we're almost to the back of that dough. You pinch it close. You always want the part that you close, the seam that you make, you always want that to be the bottom of your loaf. Otherwise it can unroll and you'll end up with a flap that comes up. So once again, you can kind of tuck your ends if you want. I really for my family, when I'm making it for my family, I don't usually care exactly how it looks. I just want it to taste good and be the right texture and be edible. So a little bit of spray again. I just use Pam, and into the pan it's ready. Okay, so when these rise, you're going to do plastic wrap over the top of them. I like to spray because the plastic wrap will actually come in contact with this and it can stick to the dough. So you want to spray your plastic wrap. You want these to stay wet. That's why you're using plastic wrap. If you use a towel, it can dry out. I like plastic wrap because it keeps it moist in here. So I spray my plastic wrap, put it over the top of these, and then I put these, like I said, back in my microwave. That's where I like to use is my proofing box. You can make your own proofing box, even like with a heating pad. I've seen a lot of people make those. It just has to be covered and airtight, basically, no draft, and you want to have your doughs covered. Whether it's the first rise or the second rise, you want to make sure that happens. So these are ready to rise. I'm going to actually cover these and put them in so they don't get dried out. That dough in the bowl should be about ready to show you the test on it. Then we'll almost be done. So this is kind of crazy. I put it on and then I spray it because plastic wrap is not my friend. And then I flip it over. Too hard to spray it otherwise. And I do actually just cover them together. And then they'll go in my microwave. So I'll put them in there and I'll be right back. Okay. Alright, let's take a look at this dough. Is that where they can see? Okay. You can see it's really smooth. It's gotten way smooth. It's still a little bit tacky. Let's try a test on it and see what it looks like. Okay, so we talked before about a window pane test. It's not going to work the same on this dough. It's just got those really sharp pieces in it and it's going to cut open. So normally I just do it while it's still attached. I'll just pull some of it up from the bowl and look at it, but because you can't see that, I'll actually pull a piece of the dough off. Okay, so it doesn't matter what kind you're making. If you're making a yeast spread, you want to do a test like this because it's going to tell you whether or not you've got enough gluten form to actually keep your bread. The gluten is the structure of the bread. That's what holds it up. That's what makes the texture what you like it. It keeps it soft. It keeps it springy. Okay, you can see that I can stretch this out and it gets really thin so that you can almost see through it. You'll see some little breaks. You see that part right there that's really thin. I don't know how well that'll show on the camera. And it will start to tear. Like I said, it does have those really sharp edges, but you can see initially anyway that it's got that formation. We'll try it again here up close where you can maybe see it better. You start stretching it out. It's really stretchy. Just, I mean, maybe you can see that when I'm stretching it, but it's really stretchy. I actually think it's tougher dough than a white dough. I think it's a little bit tougher, but it does tear because of those pieces. But you can see it's thinning out and you can almost see through it. This could go a little bit longer, but just so that you know, that's the test. So when this is done kneading, you're going to cover this up. I actually just leave it in my mixer unless I'm making consecutive loaves, but I do grease my bowl. I like to leave it in here though, so I will, where's my scraper? I just move it over. I'll just kind of flip it up and I'll spray one side and then flip it back to that side and spray the other. And then I want to make sure that the top of the loaf also got oiled. If I need to flip it all the way over, I can. You can see that's now shiny, so it's got oil on it. Okay, my mixer actually comes with a lid, which I have no idea where it is. Wow, okay. Well, my mixer comes with a lid. And some mixers do, some mixers don't. But that's what I use. If you don't have the lid, you can use plastic wrap. Since I don't have my lid for some reason, I'm going to just put plastic wrap over this one. So this is going to rise, the first rise, about 45 minutes. I would check it at 45 minutes. It should be pretty close if you've got it somewhere warm and not drafty. You should be pretty close to doubled. if not more than double at 45 minutes. If you got a really warm place, maybe check it at a half hour, 35 minutes. In my kitchen, it's usually about 70 degrees, maybe a little less. And then without the breeze and in the microwave where it contains that moisture and the heat in there, it's probably, I don't know, 75, 77. Actually, I've never taken a temperature there to see. Okay, so that I would go in for the first rise. Okay, the second rise, when it's in the loaf pans, that one is going to be, your first rise is more forgiving. So if you let this one go a little bit too long, if this goes a little longer on the first rise, gets a little more than double, you're not going to have a problem. The one that you're going to have a problem with if you neglect is your second rise, when it's in your pans and already shaped. So if those ones get too much, if you let those go too long, you're going to have bread that collapses. And basically what happens is the structure, the yeast creates so much bubble in there that it thins out the structure, and when it starts to bake, it can't hold up its own weight, so it will collapse. You'll have a loaf that looks beautiful and all puffy, perfect loaf shape, but then when it actually bakes, you're going to end up with one that usually sinks somewhat on the top. Sometimes they can really collapse. That's not what you want. Obviously you want a loaf that's, nice and fluffy and stretchy. Okay, so this is the first rise. Like I said, about 45 minutes on this one. Second rise, I usually check at about 25 minutes, and if it is above the edge of the pan by about an inch, I will turn on my oven. Okay, on the white bread, when we made white bread, I talked about how I let it go till it's about an inch over, and then I put it in the oven. On wheat bread, you actually want to let the wheat bread rise to almost the size of the loaf. So you're not going to get the kind of oven spring in a wheat loaf as you would on a white loaf. You're going to want to let it rise longer after it's shaped to give you really close to the size loaf that you are going to have in the end. So what I look for on mine, it should be above the pan, pretty much all the way around the edges, all four edges of the loaf pan. It should almost be to, and it'll be probably about 2 inches in the middle above the edge. It'll be about 2 inches higher than the edge of your loaf pan. That's what you want to look for. And definitely you want to do a poke test. The poke test on those, it's hard to show it here, but so this would be when it's in your loaf pan, not in the bowl. But a poke test, you basically just poke with your finger. You're looking for it to stay. I don't know if you can see on this, but maybe I get this up here. Is that focused? So if I poke this dough right now, it springs right back. I mean, it doesn't take hardly any time, and it's springing right back. If you poke a loaf that's already proofed and is really close to ready to bake, you're going to leave an indent, and it's going to slowly come back out. This one, I mean, it's pretty much disappeared in less than, 5 seconds. One that's ready to bake is going to be very slow to rise back up, if it even does at all. Now, if it's really soft when you poke it, it's probably overproofed. Like I said, that's the one that's not forgiving. The first rise is going to be more forgiving. The second rise is not. That's the one you have to really babysit and watch. And you do want to preheat your oven. So on this loaf, it's a 350-degree oven. If you have convection, where it's making 2 loaves, I prefer convection. If you don't know your conversion for that, convection usually is a little bit lower temperature. On mine, it's 25 degrees lower. So for a 350-degree oven, I would set mine at 325 if I'm going to convect. And if you don't know what a convection oven is, basically all it is your oven has a fan at the back, and it circulates that air, and you just get a more even temperature throughout the oven. It alleviates the hot spots, and you end up with a little more even with different pans. So especially it's good if you're doing like a multi-rack. If you have 2 racks you're trying to bake on, you'll get a lot more precise results. You're not going to have to switch them around if you use convect. With loaf pans, if you're using 2 loaf pans on 1 rack, it's probably not going to be too bad to just do them on regular. I wouldn't be too upset about doing them on regular if you don't want to use convect or if you don't have convect. You might want to turn them maybe the last 10 minutes of the bake, just so that they're getting browned evenly. Kind of, just look at them. If they look like they're even, they're probably even. If they look like they're browning uneven, there's probably a problem. So that's how I would judge that. As far as bake time, I go for 30 minutes. At 30 minutes, I'm going to start checking. And I've talked about this before. This is my best friend for baking or cooking. It's an instant read thermometer. This one is made by ThermalWorks. It's a ThermaPen. You can get all different price ranges and all different kinds of instant read thermometers. I love this one. It's had a hard life, but it still works great. It's made by a company local here to American Fork. They make some that are cheaper, some that are more expensive. This one I love because it folds up. If I'm cooking somewhere else, I actually fold it up and put it in my pocket and take it with me. But the thing about this is exact. There's no guessing whether or not your loaf is done when you use a thermometer. So on a loaf of bread, whether it's white or wheat, I like to cook until my loaves are at 192 to 195. That's going to keep your loaves from getting dried out. It's going to keep your crust from getting too thick and dry, too hard. You're going to end up with a loaf that's nice and soft on the inside and a crust that's really, obviously a wheat bread is going to have a little bit tougher crust. It's going to be a little drier, but it's still going to be very edible if you keep it at that 192, 195. If your hydration is right. If your dough is too dry, you're going to end up with that thick crust. If you haven't kneaded it enough, you're going to end up with that thick crust. You're going to end up with a texture that's, more crumbly. And that's what I really don't like about wheat bread. Maybe there's people that really like that about wheat bread. I'm sure there's somebody out there that does. But I want bread that's, super edible. I want to make this bread and have my kids want to eat it. I want to make, the bread that my kids are going to want to eat and that we're going to actually consume and not just be a waste of ingredients, especially like right now when ingredients are hard to get. So if you have wheat in storage, hopefully you do have the Vital Wheat and gluten. I would hope that people have talked about that enough that you've added it. If you haven't, start looking for it. Obviously you can make this without. It's not absolutely necessary, but you're going to have different results and you might not like the results you get. It's just really hard to get that gluten development that you want for the structure of your bread without that additional Vital Wheat gluten. As far as the other ingredients that this has, most people store honey. If you don't store honey, you can use brown sugar or regular sugar, but the honey does have an effect. There is a scientific reason for adding the honey besides just having it be the sweetener. There is an actual effect that it has that you're going to want to have. The lemon juice, the acid, that's a very common ingredient when you use whole grain. You'll find that in several different things. If you make cookies, even if you use like a whole grain cookie recipe, you might find that has either a vinegar or a lemon juice in it. It's a dough conditioner. It improves the dough. It improves what's actually happening with your grains, with your whole grain. If you don't like the flavor of the vinegar, do lemon juice. I personally like the lemon juice better because I don't want to taste it. If you like kind of a sourdough taste, like I said, use the vinegar. Yeast, we talked about yeast. Store whatever you want. I have yeast that's been stored either in my freezer or in cold storage. It's probably 3 or even more years expired. Don't throw out your yeast. Test it and see if it works. Most of the time, yeast is still good unless it's been stored too hot, or maybe if it was bad in the first place. I do buy my yeast usually in bulk when I can get it. It's really hard to find right now, whether you're buying it in bulk or otherwise. So obviously, you want to store yeast. There's really no reason to store wheat if you don't have all the things that you need to make bread. I mean, obviously there's other things you can do with your wheat. You can, do cracked wheat or as cereal. But basically I think that you need to store all the ingredients you need for bread. Okay, so the last of this, we're going to just show 2 different loaves here so you can see the inside. Oh yeah. So my daughter actually made whole wheat cookies today. And this recipe has the lemon juice in it as well. These are not hard, they're not heavy, they're actually really good. I can give you this recipe as well too. That's all whole grain. Obviously it has sugar, so if you're going for, no sugar, but that's not gonna be your thing. This is not a no sugar recipe. And yes, sugar actually has a reason to have it in there. But these are also whole grain. No white flour in that. That's made with, I think it was red. I don't know, it could have been white. Either one, it'll work with either one. They really are interchangeable. I think you should probably try out both and see which one you like the best. I do think I get a little bit fluffier loaf, like I said, out of the red, but maybe that's a fluke. I don't know. Maybe it's just the brand I have. I don't know. I don't have a lot of wheat stored, but the ones that I do have, I have a couple different brands. different sources. That could be part of it. So that's the other thing is, you're going to have a little bit different results based on where you get your wheat. Same as if where you get your flour. I talked about that before. Where you get your flour, the kind of bread flour that you use is going to make a difference on your results as well. I usually use what I can get from Lehigh Roller Mills, but because I haven't been able to get that, I've had to kind of alter my recipe. And something you have to just know what you're looking for. That's why I said the technique last time more than doing an actual recipe was just kind of give you an idea of the technique behind any bread making, no matter what recipe you do. But really, once you master one good bread recipe, you know what you're looking for. You can take any bread recipe after that, and you know what you're looking for. You don't want to be too dry. You want to know where that hydration is right. You want to make sure your kneading is good. If you've got good kneading, good hydration, and then you do good shaping, you're going to have good bread. Doesn't matter what kind of bread you're talking about. Okay, so let's get out the loaves here. So this is a red one that I made earlier. If you're going to get into making bread all the time, it's hard to find bread bags locally that are long enough. These ones I think I got from a restaurant supply. I bought a huge, gigantic. I make almost all of our own breads, so I always try to have good bread bags. And I usually reuse them, for a couple loaves during the week. I also freeze my bread. I talked about this when we made the white. So when I freeze my breads, I wrap them tight in plastic wrap. I'll do once around this way, once around that way, make sure they're all completely sealed off on all the corners. And then I actually store my multiple loaves inside a big clear garbage bag. And I just tie it off, stick it in my freezer. We'll pull out a loaf, retie the bag, and that's just how I do it. I figure that gives it that little extra protection inside that bag, but it's not actually touching the bag. And obviously it's a clean garbage bag. So this is one that I made earlier. This is a red wheat, 100% red. It is very light and fluffy. This is not a heavy loaf at all. You can see that it is very soft. It is not a brick like sometimes you end up with. And this is not something that you can't do. You can do this. This is possible. You just got to get the techniques right. So let's cut this one. So we talked about cutting before too. I'm going to use my same breadboard here. The breadboard that I usually cut on is gone. So if you have a good bread knife that you like, this is where you can see. If you have a good bread knife that you like, bread knives are usually serrated. They usually have the big scallops. Use that. I personally cannot cut bread with one of those knives, even if it is a good one. And what I use is my electric knife. I like it the best. It actually came with, so we're talking about just like the same kind of knife that you would use to carve your turkey on Thanksgiving. This one has been around, probably looks kind of sad. This one's a GE one. It actually came with a bread blade. I don't know if you can see that, but it actually says bread blade on it. So it came with one that's a meat and one that's a bread. And I don't know if you've ever seen these. If you haven't seen these before, they usually just have two blades. They hook together. And the method of cutting is basically that it just saws back and forth really quick. But it does have that scallop edge, and that's really what I think does a good job of cutting the bread. You practice with this a little bit, and you'll be cutting really nice, even. I don't know if I have a place to plug this in. Okay, well, I guess I won't cut it for you, but anyway, I'll show you some of the inside of the other loaf. So this is what I use. It is a lot easier to get nice, even slices. Once you practice with this a little bit, you can get nice, thin, so you're making good use of a loaf. You're not ending up with, 5 slices out of a loaf. You can easily get probably 12, 14, maybe even 15 slices out of that easily. So that's the other, if you have a bread knife, this one looks like it's had a hard life. But yeah, same thing, scalloped. The reason they're scalloped is so that you're not pressing down on it. It really is a saw action. That's why you have the scallops. So I have one that I cut. It's the other one out of the same batch. Let me get that one.
There's a question.
Okay.
You went over living in higher altitude. What happens when you live at 50 feet above sea level? Do you lessen the yeast and liquid or keep it the same?
Okay, so on at lower altitude, you're going to go do the opposite. So you could probably try it at what the ingredients are now for this recipe. See what your results are. and then decide, if you like it or not. Otherwise, if you want to adjust it, you're going to do the opposite. So instead of more water, you're going to go a little bit less water. Instead of less yeast, you're going to be more yeast. And your rise time is going to be longer. Where it's shorter at high level, it's going to be longer at closer to sea level. Your bake times and also your oven times can be affected. Usually at a higher altitude, you might even need to raise your oven temperature at a high altitude, where at a lower altitude, you're going to have a lower temperature. The altitude affects how fast the moisture evaporates. That's what the big difference is. Just like when you boil water at different altitudes, you get different results and different times and even different temperatures that things boil at. So that's the difference. It's the same concept when you bake bread. There's really no difference. Okay, so here is the sister of this loaf from earlier. My kids made me cut into this one because they thought they were dying. So this is what I'm going to show you, though, is the reason you want to do your shaping. This is my thing. I don't know why this is my thing, but I love to see bread that has been shaped right. And hopefully you can see this. Tell me if it's close enough. If you look at a good loaf, you'll see that circular pattern. I love that. That means that this bread is going to be probably nice and soft and stretchy. So let me just show you. I mean, then you can see this is really soft. It's really springy. It's got a lot of bounce to it. But the thing I love, look at how stretchy that is. There's no crumbly here. And you can see that it comes apart in that circle. And I don't know why that's magic. I think it's just because it holds that moisture in better. You're basically making a blanket, around the outside of that, that loaf is blanketed so that all of that moisture and all those bubbles get held in there. But I mean, this is soft. This is not crumbly. You can make a sandwich out of this and it's going to be good. That's good bread. Okay, so I think we're pretty much done. Are there any last questions? I hope I covered everything that everybody had mentioned. I know the high altitude was one and measuring flour was one. Were there any other questions that I missed from the last time? Any other questions anybody has about the wheat? I know they recommend if you are going to store wheat that you have multiple ways to grind it. So obviously if we get in a situation where there's no power, your electric grinder is not going to do a lot for you. So a lot of people recommend having both, an electric one, for good times and a hand crank one for bad times. There's some hand crank ones that really are not that great. If you really want to invest in one, go online and search some of the reviews. There's some really good reviews on YouTube of the hand crank ones. I think the one that people like the best is one that actually has the huge wheel, that you turn the huge wheel. And some people even have it so that they can power that wheel as well. So like if they had a generator, they could use a generator to power that wheel. If you're going to have a generator, to me, you could probably just have a regular, electric one. But the concept behind having the big wheel instead of a little tiny crank is you're getting a lot more power per crank. So, going around one time is giving you more grind than the little tiny crank one that your arm's going to want to fall off after you've cranked a cup of flour, basically. Okay, and also, that was the other thing. So we talked about the wheat berries. It's not a direct conversion. So a cup of wheat berries does not give you a cup of flour. It's actually going to be more flour. So I haven't actually measured this out to be exact, but I want to say it's about somewhere between a half and 75. So if I want a cup of flour, I'm going to probably grind about 3/4 of a cup of wheat berries, and I'll probably end up with more flour than I need. But yeah, cup for cup, not the same. You get more flour than you actually have berries.
Question, can you use sourdough starter?
Okay, you can use sourdough starter with wheat bread, or with wheat flour. I actually have a sourdough starter, and I decided I wanted to try converting it to be, so it was made, I made it myself. It's about 3 years old, and I just made it with bread flour. I decided I wanted to try converting it to be wheat, fresh ground wheat. I really wasn't happy with the starter itself being wheat, and I have made a couple that I've added some wheat to, but I will say you're not going to get excellent results out of sourdough if you don't have some portion of bread flour in there. I think they usually say probably no more than about 50 to 75 at the very most, percentage wise. I would stick closer to 50. 50% whole wheat, 50% bread flour. That's going to give you a little bit better quality, better results. But it's going to be kind of a trial and error. You're going to have to figure out, it's all going to depend on what kind of flour you've got, what kind of, what the protein percentage is in that flour. Different brands, even across different brands, bread flour is going to have a different percentage of protein. And the percentage of protein is what gives you that gluten. That's the makings of gluten, is the protein in flour. So you want a high protein to get that gluten. When you grind your own wheat, you don't start with that. The good thing about sourdough is it does give extra time for hydration. So most sourdough recipes, and we've talked about doing another class on sourdough, and we can do that if there's interest as well. So in a sourdough recipe, you start out with there's actually multiple ways, but for example, mine starts out with your starter, a percentage of your starter, your flour, your water, your salt. And that to me is purest sourdough. If you don't add anything else, that's sourdough to me. Obviously, you can use your sourdough starter to make pretty much any kind of bread, or even not bread. I mean, waffles, pancakes, whatever. It's worthwhile if you're going to get into bread, do sourdough because it's fun. I mean, if you really like to make bread, you're going to like to make sourdough. But it is a commitment because it's like a pet. You have to feed it. You have to take care of it. It's not going to be there for you if you haven't been taking care of it. So it's, about a once a week at least commitment, once every 2 weeks minimum, or you're going to have trouble with that starter and it's not going to do what it needs to do. The sourdough starter replaces your yeast. You don't add yeast to sourdough because the wild yeast that you basically harvested, this wild yeast into this container of flour and water, and that's what gets your dough, the same rise as what you would get out of yeast. So it takes some maintenance. It's going to take you some time. Like I said, I have not made a whole wheat one. I haven't had an occasion to want to. Maybe I want to now, just so that I know I can or can't do it. But I think to start out with, I would probably try a 50-50 just to see what I get. But, obviously you can experiment with that any way you want. I do think you're going to have a hard time getting really excellent results at first. You're going to have to play with it and decide what you like. You're also probably going to want to play with what type of wheat you use. It might be that, white wheat is better for your sourdough than red wheat. That was another thing I actually wanted to mention. So you'll see when you buy wheat, it'll sometimes say winter wheat, hard winter wheat, or a hard white winter wheat. Okay, so when you see the winter and the spring on wheat, it's really talking about when it was planted. So usually hard wheat was planted in the fall and it grew throughout the winter. And it has a higher protein content. So that's usually what people store when they're going to use it for bread. You want that higher protein content. So you'll usually end up with winter wheat. Spring wheat is usually a softer wheat that usually gets used in pastry. So you're talking like pie crust, cookies, stuff that's going to be more pastry-like, something you want that softer dough. You don't want to have quite the structure that you get out of a hard wheat. But if you think about it, if you get confused, think about the fact that once it's planted in the fall, it has to weather the winter and it's building up strength. So it's more protein. It's a higher protein if it's a winter wheat. And that goes for both white and red. And you'll see that, like I said, when you buy it, sometimes it'll actually say right on it, winter, as well as the color. Any other questions? If not, we'll go ahead and end, and I will post the recipe. If you weren't jotting it down, I will post the recipe in the comments of this video. The link usually still works. If you want to come back and watch it, you can share it. And like I said, if there's interest, we could do a sourdough class as well. I just think the live ones are a little better than watching just a YouTube video. And trust me, if you want to go back and look at techniques and different people's techniques, there are tons of videos on YouTube about bread making. I would say stick with recipes that are coming from a source that's reliable. Like I said, there's a lot of weird recipes circulating right now because people, are in more of a desperate situation without being able to get all the supplies. Be really cautious about using those recipes. Like I said, I've seen a couple that are missing some vital ingredients, and you don't want to waste your ingredients right now. Now, I don't like to waste ingredients anytime, but especially now when you're having a hard time finding things to buy. Don't waste your ingredients. Make sure you're making a recipe that's going to turn out edible, you know, that your family's going to actually enjoy, hopefully. Any other questions? If not, we're going to go ahead and end. Like I said, I'll put the recipe in the comments. You can share this link. It'll still be available. It still works even though it's not live anymore. If you want to refer back to it, that's fine. And thanks for coming and watching, and hopefully you learned a few things.